This is FRM Part 2, Book 3, Operational Risk and Resiliency, in the chapter on Principles for Operational Resilience. Those of you who have watched the previous recording on the chapter on impact tolerance will note that there are lots of similarities and linkages between this chapter and the previous chapter. And the good news is that this is a relatively short chapter, and so we have a pretty short slide deck for you. But what I want to do is I want to start off by reading a sentence that comes right out of the first paragraph or two of this chapter. I need to take my glasses off here. You ready for this? Operational resilience is an outcome that benefits from effective management of operational risk. So a couple of things in that definition. The first is that it is an outcome, operational resilience. Look for that on a possible exam answer. That benefits from effective management of operational risk. So what does that mean? That means that we need to identify the risk, we need to quantify the risk, we need to mitigate the risk, we need to monitor the risk. And this is all because we, as good financial risk managers, are concerned about disruptions. You remember in that last recording, I made the comment that if I were a chief risk officer, I would, at least for a while, be super unpopular because I would be going around saying to everybody, are you worried about this disruption? Are you worried about that disruption? And after a while, we start changing the culture. Remember how important the risk culture is from a previous recording. And so the goal here is to get everybody thinking about how can we manage these disruptions so that we, A, do not cause harm to our customers, and then B, do not cause harm to the entire financial industry. Now, the second piece of good news is that there are only two learning objectives here. So define and describe, we do those all the time. Operational resilience, I feel like I've already done that, but we'll do that again. And then probably the more important of the two objectives, explain recommended principles. So we have a handful of slides on that. So here's this formal definition of operational resilience. The ability of an organization, right? So think about this. And by the way, both in this chapter and in the previous chapter, the authors use the term firms. And so they don't really specifically target banks and financial institutions. They generalize to any kind of for-profit business organization. But of course, our main focus is on financial institutions. So being able to provide those business services. And so remember, I say this all the time. Think of a financial institution as different silos, retail banking, wealth management, ATMs, all that kind of stuff. These different silos. And remember from that previous recording, we talked about these important business services, right? These important business components. So these silos, if they're important, then we need to anticipate, prevent, and recover from these adverse operational events. So we need to understand how multiple domains, that's why we're going to talk about mapping later on here. When we do this mapping, we go from one city to another city, if we're doing some geographic map. And notice what we have in bold there, work in unison to drive service delivery. Yeah, knowing how each domain works, so domains and silos and how it would impact those operations and the delivery. And then once again, we use these terms, anticipate, prevent, and adapt. Here's a good illustration of what I was just referring to. So these are called the cornerstones. So governance, clear roles and responsibilities of executive senior leadership team, in particular for financial institutions, the chief risk officer. So clear roles and responsibilities, but also how that relates to the overall risk culture that's established by the board. So in that governance over there, remember, you have those two groups, the board and then the executive leadership team. And this is what I was talking about just a second ago, organizational focus, these critical business components that are simply not allowed to fail, because if they fail, then we'll harm our clients, our customers, and the entire financial market system. Measurement, we talk about this all the time. Quantify the effects of failure or disruption. And then, of course, tolerances. Remember in that previous recording, we talked at length about impact tolerances. And then integration. This is one of my favorite words because there's no way that we can support the recovery from this disruption unless we all work together as not only individual silos or segments or components, but the correlations or the copulas between and among those so that we can rise above. And then preparedness, this of course means, all right, suppose this thing happens, like a disruption in our electronic banking, then how are we going to handle it? So look at that last question there on the bottom right. Are such plans adaptable? And here are two good examples. Raphael's Bank, back in 2015 or so, there was a breakdown in their debit cards, and about 4,000 customers could not use their cards on a particular date. And so you might think to yourselves, boy, you know, one day, that's probably not too big of a deal, but it's a huge deal. Just because I don't use my debit card every day doesn't mean that Raphael's Bank ATM customers don't collectively use their cards every day. And then Nokia, this is an interesting one. They were trying to figure out what kind of an operating system to use in their smartphones, and they kept a hold of this one. They showed resistance, and it ended up not working out. And then it was taken over. Nokia was taken over by Microsoft, somewhere around 2012 or 2013. It might be worth just a little bit of homework assignment for you to look at this relationship because there's a mystery involved. There were accusations of secret agents and outsourcing of plans and moles and all sorts of clandestine operations going on before that acquisition. I have no idea whether or not it's true, but it makes for a good mystery novel or maybe a good Netflix TV show. All right, this is probably the more important of the two learning objectives. So let's go ahead and look at these principles for maintaining a strong operational resilience. All right, governance. So this is what I was saying earlier. Notice what we have in bold down on the bottom: board of directors and senior management. And there are some arrow points down there that you should probably memorize, but I think we've been through this many, many times before. But let's go ahead then and focus now this on operational resilience, which means we need to be able to recover from disruptive events, which include things like, COVID, include things like natural disasters, includes things like power outages from other kinds of natural disasters. So look up at the top where we have in bolded white lettering, minimize their impact on delivering critical operations. So this goes back to me as my chief risk officer role by saying, hey, what happens if we have a typhoon? What happens if we have X and Y and Z? Do you remember that great movie, Apollo 13, where those 3 U.S. astronauts were trying to find their way back home, and the great team in Houston was doing everything they can? I mean, this is a great example of senior leadership and board. Now, I'm not sure there was a board of directors at Nassau, but I mean, they worked together as a team and they delivered all of these A and B and C. And you remember Tom Hanks said, we need to do this one and this one and this one. Before we get to that one, let's do one step at a time. This is a great lesson to learn about operational resilience. And then at the end of the movie, one of the guys called the flight deck and said, hey, there's a typhoon warning, somewhere on the edge of where they were supposed to splash down in the sea. And the flight director said, boy, is there anything we can do about it? And at the end, they were like, you know what, let's just forget about it. Now, we can't forget about these things when we're approaching this from the board and the senior management team. Operational risk management. So this leads directly into what I was saying about potential failures as people, processes, and systems. Of course, in the Apollo 13 example, there was really no failure of people, but there was a failure of, the O-rings or something, processes and systems. How about this? Go back to, what year was this? You guys probably remember better than I do, 2014, 2015, when that trader who became known as the London whale for JP Morgan, was doing all this trading in the credit default swap market and piled up losses of $2 billion that was estimated. And I think once it was all said and done, it was about $6 billion worth of losses. So there's a failure in all three of those things. And so note what we have in bolded there, a timely manner to identify all of these vulnerabilities, whether they are individuals or groups of individuals, processes, or systems. Notice we have work closely down there, sufficient controls. Just think Apollo 13, working closely together for an outcome. Remember what I said earlier? I read you that definition, and it was an outcome. The outcome in Apollo 13 was to bring those astronauts back safely. The outcome here is to have a lack of a disruption of our business services. All right, business continuity planning and testing. What is this? Forward looking, of course. This is what I go around and I say, what happens if this? What happens? What happens? So we're going to identify all of those critical operations, which are both internal and external, and then say, all right, here's a critical operation, and you three individuals are responsible for handling that. And you go do this all the way along. You could call this some form of mapping. But here we get into the formal mapping interconnections and interdependencies. And this is not just with people and processes and systems, but this is the whole system of each one of these silos. And notice what we have in bolded down at the bottom, granular enough. That seems to be a popular finance term. And so we want to get down into the finest grains of sand to identify which individual or which process or which system or which database or which piece of information is going to make sure that that sand is in its right place after one of these events that may cause a disruption. And then you probably remember from the impact tolerance recording about the importance of third-party dependency. So we have all these third-party relationships, and we need to make sure that we pick up the phone and call the third parties and say something like, hey, this is all the stuff that we're doing. Here, we'll help you figure it out. You figure it out so that if you have a disruption on your end, that we can work through it and we can arrive at a positive outcome for all of us. And so notice that arrow point, third party should have at least equivalent level of operational resilience. So this is where I need to comment on due diligence when we contract with that third party. If you're a strong financial institution like, the Gibraltar Financial Institution, and I'm someone like Jim's Clearinghouse, and so you hire me to clear some of your transactions, and you don't perform your due diligence, sufficient due diligence, well, you might find that from 12 to 2 o'clock every day, I like to go out back and play volleyball with my children. And so I'm going to be out during those hours every day of the week. And you're going to say to yourself, well, poor Jim, he's having a great time out there, but we're having a disruption and he's supposed to deliver these services to us and he's not doing it. Incident management. So these are the examples that what I was referring to earlier, but we have a history of incidents. We can go back and look over the last 3 years or 5 years or 7 years and say, okay, we faced this weather disaster. We faced this breakdown in one of our systems. We faced this disruption of one of our critical operations, and this is how we handled it. And boy, we can do a much better job going forward. So we take a look at what's happened to us in the past. We don't want to repeat history, but then we expand this. This is one of those things that I always love teaching my students when I say something like, hey, there are embedded options in all kinds of assets that we have out there. So we learn from an historical incident, and then we say, all right, if this repeats itself, given today's market environment, these are the likely add-ons to that incident. So it's not going to be an exact repeat, but it's going to be a repeat with dynamic variables that are changing. And so it's our responsibility as good financial risk managers to identify those possibilities. So what do we have in bold there? Severity, recovery and response measures, and then communication logs. That makes perfect sense. Let's go ahead and move on to the last principle, ICT and cybersecurity. When I hear and when I read about these kinds of phrases, I always think to myself as if I were, maybe a 15-year-old young man. When I have some kind of disruption, I would just pick up the phone and call my dad. And I would say, Dad, I'm in trouble. What can we do about this? But now, of course, we have tremendous information and communications and technology and security and cybersecurity, all of these interrelated systems that, boy, what do we have written there? Protection, detection, response. We know all this kind of stuff just from our regular old lifetimes trying to secure our own systems inside of our house, let alone all the experience we have in securing the systems in our workplace. This is what I tell my students regularly. I say, look, it's awesome that you have decided to be a business student, especially if you've decided to be a finance major. But I recommend to many of them, hey, let's go outside of the School of Business and look for a minor. And a lot of our kids, they want to have a minor in accounting or a minor in leadership. And those are all good things. But I suggest to them, I say, look, go out there and get a minor in English so that you can go work for a financial institution and you can be the lead person on all of this documentation process. If you study English, then you learn how to write better, you learn how to read better. So these security measures should be well documented and efficiently and effectively written. Notice that we have in bold down there that these critical information and infrastructure assets should be identified. Swing back up to the definition of that principle, the delivery of the critical operations of the bank. And I think that takes us through those two learning objectives. So my focus, if I were you preparing for the exam, would be in those 7 recommended principles, in addition to the definition of operational resilience. So I think if you take the first part of this chapter and lump it into the last chapter on impact tolerance, you'd be able to answer those questions and then add those recommended principles there.